Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where every week we amplify voices from across the ag industry. We aggregate those perspectives, all in service of elevating our collective thinking around strategy execution. I'm your host, Joe Mosier, and as always, I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us today. A real quick reminder before today's show to like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And at the end of today's discussion, if you're so inclined, we would love it if you'd consider leaving us a review to let us know how you're enjoying the show and let us know how we're doing. Now, today is the third and final part of our three-part strategy activation mini-series right here in the Pacesetter Pod. If you missed recent episodes, in the first part, we talked about the problems that flow from the imperfect framing of this process called strategic planning. In the second episode, we talked about why the process itself is somewhat broken, namely some of the concerns and problems I have with the SWOT analysis process and how it generates some lackluster discussions and decisions, the nature of the process being rushed, and even more importantly, the process and how it lacks the rigor to make tough but necessary and explicit decisions about how to ultimately allocate resources, and really how those decisions have such an outsized impact on the actual underlying strategy and the advancement thereof. Today is the So What episode. So I intend to get into, sharing our process for strategy activation and how we sidestep some of the many pitfalls covered in those first two parts. You don't need to go back and listen to parts 1 and 2 to get the benefit from today, but I would encourage you to go back and listen at some point if you haven't to already, as it's definitely going to save you from committing some of the many unforced errors that we discussed, especially if you don't follow our strategy activation process, which will sort of protect you from some of those pitfalls along the way. Okay, so let's get into it. What does a better approach to activating strategy look like? I'm going to give you a little sneak preview of the 4 main points that I really hope that you walk away with today. There's a lot of details underneath these, but if you need to remember 4 things, and I know it's technically supposed to be 3 things, right? But 4 things, if you walk away with these today, you'll be really in a position to do a much better job of actually connecting your strategy to the decisions and initiatives you take and pursue in service of advancing it. The first is you have to ask the right questions in the right order. And again, we'll get into what that means in just a couple of minutes here. Second, you must fight the urge to get into solving the strategy problem and choosing the actions to take to advance your strategy. One of the biggest things that happen is people front run the process. They're looking for ways to decide, what do we do to put our strategy into action? And you need to wait, as uncomfortable as it is, because those decisions will ripen with time. The third, speaking of time, you have to extend the duration of the underlying strategy activation process. No more 3 to 4 day offsites where you try to get it all done between the boundaries of 2 weekends. You have to create shorter and more frequent bursts of focus with your leadership team. And finally, you have to apply the sum of all the work that you do in what's conventionally called a strategic plan, what we're talking about as strategy activation here today. You have to take the sum of that work and apply it as a filtering function to help you objectively choose the best things to work on. You don't want to leave the decisions of what projects are we going to pursue, what initiatives are we going to launch, what's the strategic leverage we're going to pull. You don't want to leave these to brainstorming, to a straight up-down vote among your leadership team, or to the whims of your chief executive officer. So with that, let's jump in. Now, last week, I left no ambiguity about how underwhelmed I am about most SWOT analysis sessions that I've been a part of, whether I was a participant or a facilitator. And I'm not saying that the process is without merit, but I think it is without some of the necessary guardrails. But I won't use our time today taking any more shots at SWOT. Here is a better approach to get to some of the same desired outcomes. And it's asking the right questions in the right order in your process of strategy activation. So here they are in sequential order, the questions that we work with our clients to answer in the process of developing that plan. The first question is a simple summary statement of your strategic objective. This is really taking your wider strategy that underlying document, that mission, the visions, the positioning in the marketplace, the value proposition, why you exist and what you seek to accomplish, what you seek to become, those bold aspirational statements. We want to really boil it down to a single unifying statement that'll drive the process of activation. We don't in this process want to relitigate or rebuild your strategy as we look at activation. So we look first to your company strategy and then try to reflect the spirit and the intent of the strategy, if not its explicit language. We try to reflect that in the work right at the outset. This does a couple of things. One, it front runs any instinct that the team may have to redo strategy work, because you've already probably invested a lot of time and a lot of capital and a lot of people's resources into doing it. So it gets away from that. And it short circuits the process of falling back into discussions about what strategic choices you want to make, since oftentimes they've already been made, the where to play and how to win level of discussions. So one of the things that I often see is that sometimes a strategy will sit completely apart from the strategic plan, and that's a problem. Conversely, sometimes they blend together, and we talked about this in episode 1 of this mini series, or part 1 of this mini series, about how that blending of the two is also problematic. Here, we're looking to create clear, simple, connective tissue. You know what your strategy is. We start off the activation process, the quote-unquote strategic planning process, with a simple summary statement of what your strategic objective is. And if you're not sure what that might look like, of course, you can reach out to me and we can set up a call and I'll walk you through some examples that highlight exactly what this means, what it looks like, and how it helps. Now, once you've done that, the next thing you want to talk about is the urgency drivers. This is all about activation. Given the strategy that you have to ask yourself and your team, what is moving you to take action to activate it now? Now, that might seem somewhat like a strange question because obviously no one's rewarded for sitting still. But a simple bias for action doesn't really count. That's not really the urgency driving the strategy activation. What we do in our process is we have our clients think about what it is that's really incenting them or pushing them to respond to the vision, the future they want to create, or an opportunity that's available. What's requiring them to act now? And it's, typically comes down to 1 to 2 or maybe 3 in the rarest cases. Again, those things that are moving them to act. Anticipated consolidation in the industry. It could be consolidation accelerating. It could be the consumer demands for their products are shifting to their benefit or detriment. It could be that there's new market entrants and competition coming in that's going to change the competitive dynamics and it's requiring them to act now. Could be shifting, S&Ds locally or nationally or globally. It could be a lot of different things, but it's really the question is what is happening now that makes us getting to work on our strategy so urgent? Failing to do this, to ask this question, spend time doing this up front, and sort of assuming that everyone around the table shares the same urgency around strategy execution is a perfect glide path to having friction down the line. You're going to have varied expectations around why you're doing it now, varied expectations around what the urgency is. And when there's varied expectations around urgency of executing strategy, then you start to see people make different decisions around prioritization within their departments and divisions and day-to-day decisions. And it's that kind of divergence in alignment with priorities, which is actually a manifestation of misunderstanding around urgency, that actually causes a lot of the problems where you do a lot of strategic planning work, you agree on a lot of initiatives, you come back in 6, 12, 18, 24 months and realize that some groups have made tremendous progress, some have made very little. Oftentimes the breadcrumbs take you back to we didn't have alignment, not necessarily on what our strategy was, but on how urgent our strategy was to activate. And so we always talk about urgency drivers at the start of the process. So summary of statement, summary of strategic objectives, urgency drivers. So number 3, what's the state of the business today? In 2 to 3 sentences, we summarize the business today. Now, this is very tough, I'll admit, but it's impactful once you get through it. Over the long term, this short summation of the business is less important than some of the questions that are to come. I'll admit that, but it does help get your leadership team into a shared mindset around where the business is today. It usually has statements like, we're technology constrained, our sales are plateauing, we're making good progress in new territories, or we have promising products in our R&D pipeline. So they're general, they're true, but they're general yet unsubstantiated statements that clearly wouldn't stand up to scrutiny if you were a publicly listed company in the public markets, but they're sufficient for our purposes for creating a shared view of the business today. So if you see here, what we're doing is we're creating shared understanding around urgency, and we're spending a little bit of time around what's the state of the business today. Now, because I said that those are largely unsubstantiated statements, the next thing we want to do is we want to put a little bit more meat on the bones around what is the current state. And so we talk then as part 4 is what are the indicators that show us that that current state summation is true. And here we typically list out 5 to 7, though ideally no more than 10, key metrics or indicators that, again, illustrate the state of the business that we just talked about. Now, they're listed without any value judgments attached, but they're usually quantitative. It'll be things like sales, origination volume, put through, gross margin, safety results, number of new products being brought to market, customer attrition, things of that nature. Sometimes, we will do some work to code those to show which ones are, sort of a red light, green light, yellow light exercise to kind of highlight where they think they're winning or losing. But what's really important here, again, is to sort of say, okay, we described what the current state of the business is, and here's the metrics that tell us where it is. Now we jump ahead, and this is where things start to get fun. So question 5 is, what is the state of the business tomorrow? Tomorrow is we'll talk about that in a minute, but it varies from project to project. So similar to where the team previously created that shared view of the business today, here we challenge them to look at what the business will look like tomorrow. What do they intend it to be known for in X number of years? Typically 3 to 5 years, something like that in this sort of process. Now, it seems like a seemingly trivial exercise, but in my experience, it's remarkably helpful. It asks people to think unconstrained about the future, right? What do we want the company to be known for? And one of the ways to, because everyone has a different aptitude, a different willingness, a different level of comfort with creativity of thinking about that unbounded future. Some people don't think about the constraints at all, and they do truly imagine big, bold things. And some folks can't help but stay tethered to the organizational constraints that they have today, whether it's capital, infrastructure, talent, whatever it might be. So one of the things that we do, and this is going to seem kind of silly, but it works really well, is we'll often ask the participants in our meetings and our workshops to say, okay, why don't you write the title of a newspaper article that's being written about your company in the future, celebrating its success? Not the byline, not the article itself. What is that headline? What is it going to say about your co-op, about your seed company, about your feed organization? What is it going to say that celebrates its success, say 5 years into the future? Now, the fictional title of this exercise that comes out of everyone's work is not the answer to what is the state of the company tomorrow. But the words that are used and the sentiments that it inspires, we find often point the team in the right direction. So if it's not already determined, this is also where you set the scope of that activation plan. Like I said, usually 3 to 5 years out. And so if you're talking today about the state of Acme Ag Co-op in 2025, now you're likely envisioning Acme Ag Co-op 2030. And what would the press say about the co-op at that point in the future? They're talking about known for safety leadership, known for product innovation, known for exceptional service, known for dramatic growth through consolidation and acquisition, diversification and vertical integration within the supply chain, whatever it is. Those are the kinds of words and terms and phrases that come out of this exercise and usually are very helpful in getting this team, the leadership team, to develop a shared vision for what the future could look like. Now, predictably, we're getting into the end of the questions here, guys, pretty soon. Predictably, after we define that future state with some summary statements, we're going to do exactly what we did with looking at the company today. Okay, what would be the indicators and the metrics of that future state? We have to spend some time talking about what we would expect to see and what we would look at as a measure of the success of the team in creating the business they intended to. This might, just like current state, it might talk about sales, volumes, margin. They typically feature prominently. But usually when you're looking to the future, it's also going to talk about new capabilities, new characteristics, things like product or service differentiation or diversification, new territories or countries that are served, new partnerships that were formed, a new level of supply chain integration achieved. This is one of the ways that we've now sort of started to say, okay, what is our strategic objective? What requires us to take action now? Where do we sit today? Where do we want to be tomorrow? And that brings us to the final question that we spend time facilitating with our clients. And that is, what are the beliefs and assumptions that we're making about the market and the operating environment that's external to the four walls of our business? Because all of this, trying to build this connective tissue from the current state to the future state, which is effectively what strategic planning is, we have to reconcile the fact that there are external urgency drivers that are causing us to take action. There's also external factors and conditions that are going to provide the backdrop against which we take action, and we have to consider them at this point. This is really important. And despite being near the end of the questions that we ask, and often this is kind of in the groan zone of the process, if you will, this requires deep and meaningful engagement of the team. This is where the team talks about their expectations for supply and demand signals into the future. This is where they talk about what are the assumptions we're making around farmers' planting decisions. What do we believe to be true about the fiscal, monetary, and regulatory conditions? What are the assumptions we're making around access to overseas markets? Do we believe that there'll be an abundant or constrained availability of capital to invest in our business? This section, this final section of those questions, is sprinkled with risks and opportunities, strengths and weaknesses. But because of the way we've arrived at it as an alternative to the SWOT analysis process that we talked about in part 2, it's tethered closely to all the other information, which is, of course, anchored in your strategy and what you're trying to accomplish. And so it creates highly relevant decisions for the strategy activation plan that you ultimately need to make. And thus it solves that sort of wandering SWOT risk that we talked about last week, where if you just sort of ask a team, what are your strengths and weaknesses, you'll get a lot of really interesting and exciting and things you want to dig into around what are the strengths and weaknesses of our organization, but they may or may not be relevant to the future that you want to create. And coming at it this way that we've just talked about helps to short circuit that process and ensure that you're looking at the strengths, the weaknesses, the things to work on, again, closely related, tethered to, and anchored in your strategy.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
So that's the biggest part of today's discussion. Now, a few more other points I want to get into. After asking the right questions in the right order, the second thing is we need to fight the urge to choose what actions we're going to take. In the strategic planning process, the output is what are the things we're working on in the next 12, 24, 36, 48, or 60 months, right? What are the things we're going to do to make our strategy come true? And throughout this process, even our process, you and your team are going to be tempted to start to action the risks and opportunities, right? To say, well, that is absolutely an opportunity for us. Now, what are we going to do to go get it? But what you need to do is you need to hold the line, trust the process. You've answered those questions that we just talked about. It feels like you're ready. It'll feel like you're ready even before that. And so especially now when you've answered all those questions that we've covered, you're going to be abuzz with the things that you could do, or maybe things that you should have already done that'll help move the company forward. Just sit tight, fight that urge. Now, I will admit that you're going to be better positioned now to make good decisions versus the conventional process, but it's still too early. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, why it is. As a brief detour, speaking of time, I don't recommend that any of this, or certainly not all of this, happens in the course of a single multi-day leadership offsite. Now, you might be able to get the team together for a day and answer those first 7 questions that we went through. That's a pretty rich day. It's a very productive day. But even if you didn't get through all 7 of those, because it generated a lot of rich discussion that generates a lot of alignment, which then, of course, feeds the conviction and the shared energy around the strategy. It's okay. So again, we don't recommend following this in a multi-day leadership offsite. I know it's a time-honored tradition, but just consider trying something different. Take what we did and what we're going to do, and we typically spread it over roughly 3 sessions, 6, maybe 8 hours each, ideally 6, so we can keep people back in the business as much as possible over the course of about 2 months. And we might have some short calls and some homework in between. But we do this for a couple of reasons. Even the most efficient and aligned leadership teams benefit from the opportunity to do a bunch of intense work around strategy activation and then go away and chew on the items in the discussion and the decisions, and then come back to them while they're still wet clay, right? There's always this inertia effect where we decided these things the last time we were together. We're not going to revisit them when we come together the next time. And I think in the process of activating your strategy and creating a multi-year plan to win, you're forcing yourself to move too fast if you don't allow people to kind of come back and say, I've thought about that a little bit more and I have some different feelings, or I have some new questions, or hey, I just thought of a different opportunity that we need to include in this. So as we discussed earlier, during these periods where the team steps away, we talked about this last week, your leadership team can look to data that might be available that they don't have with them during the offsite, and they can look at data to test some of their ideas. They can talk with some of their direct reports. They can sort of try on the new ideas that they don't really like and see how they feel and kind of see, okay, this doesn't feel comfortable, but what are the merits? How would this work? What change impacts does it impute? With the urgency drivers and the beliefs and the assumptions stated and the future state defined, when you allow this opportunity between sessions for the leadership team to sort of sit with the ideas and stress test them a little bit, I find that it's only the imperfect ideas that lose steam and conviction over time. And that's a pretty good thing. The really sound ideas will endure and come back and be even more cemented as this is what we need to focus on. It's the ones that felt kind of good and got that kind of collective momentum in a discussion, kind of got some excitement, and then you go away and you come back and 5 out of 6 people say, yeah, I've got some concern about our ability to execute that. That's pretty telling. If once you leave the room, you start to have doubts. So by doing a multiple meetings spread out process, we actually hardwire in the opportunity for people to come back and share where they've lost conviction or clarity, discuss it, and help build that into the plan. Whether that means doubling down on what was decided or modeling, or modifying it to remove some of the things that we actually don't feel quite as strong and convicted about. So we start early, we go in short sprints, and if you do that, and see what happens, I'm confident that you'll be pleased. Okay, and finally, let's get back to where everyone wants to go. And, when do we decide what actions to take? Because that's, again, the whole intent of the strategy activation, strategic planning process. At this point now, with everything we've talked about over the last 3 weeks, you are standing on the strong foundation of all that you've built. And you should be confident in its structural integrity because you also let that foundation cure over time. So now you're in a position to start to decide what to do. The process of getting all the ideas around how to connect our current state to our desired future state within the context of the beliefs and assumptions that we have about the operating environment, it's really no different in our process from how it is in everyone else's process. Whether that's brainstorming, affinitization exercises, which I'm a big fan of, group discussions, etc., that's all fine and good. The process of surfacing, collecting, inventorying all the different things that you could do to move the company forward. But where the approach that I'm advocating for differs is that you have to use the work that you have done as a stress testing mechanism to ensure that you choose the ideas with the highest strategic alignment as defined by the highest expected impact, both in the actual value of the impact as well as which element of the strategy it impacts. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that. So value the impact and sort of the distribute impact across the multiple levers of what you're trying to accomplish. This is like using what you know about the future that you want to create in the conditions in which you operate as a filtering function applied to the things that you want to do to get there. So I'm not going to walk you through all the mechanics because they're kind of hard to explain in an audio-only medium and it would make for a really long episode. But here's kind of the idea in general. What we do is once we've answered those 7 questions, we work with the leadership team or a subset of the leadership team, sometimes the CEO and CFO, for example, and we identify within the information that we've documented what factors should be used to judge the initiatives that you want to take. And then once we've identified those factors, we give each of them a weighting because we recognize that not all of the factors are created equal. For example, you might have some strategic objectives that talk about sales growth. You might have part of your strategy says we need to drastically improve our safety results, reduce incidents and fatalities. You might have a set of measures that say we need to diversify into adjacent categories where we feel uniquely competent to compete and win based on our capabilities. And so if these are all the things that you want to do in the future, sales volume growth, improve safety results, diversification, you probably have some operating efficiency metrics, financial ratios. There's a lot of different things that go in here. What we do is we make sure that we look at those, we say these are going to be the criteria that we judge strategic initiatives against, and we assign them a weight because we know that some of them are going to be weighted more heavily than others. Now, this is done out in the open with buy-in of the factors and the weightings by the entire team. And then each strategic initiative is assessed based on this model. So if you know that here's the 10 criteria that we're looking at for every project. Does it drive sales growth? Does it improve our safety results? Does it reduce our potentially our debt load? Does it increase diversification? Does it allow us to serve larger growers? Does it make better use of our own fleet? Whatever those factors are, you've got them on the table, you got the weightings, and it doesn't mean that every initiative has to hit all of those. It just means that the scoring and the rubric is clear. You know what the test is testing against. And then you take each strategic initiative and you base it on that model. Again, out in the open. To some that this can, and I'll admit some people can feel this is like overly technical or over-engineered, but the reality is that it does several really invaluable things at this stage in the process. It will assign an objective relative score to each initiative, which is a very powerful means of comparison of the merits of an initiative versus a straight strength of the argument approach. Typically what I see happen in a lot of legacy or conventional strategic planning processes is the interpersonal dynamics, the positional authority, the loudest voice, seniority, whatever it is, they tend to, over time, create the strongest argument, which then gets the project on the list. And they may be right, but it almost always lacks an objective measuring mechanism that allows you to assess it back against other ones. And you don't necessarily want just the person who's been in the business the longest or has the biggest job title or has the loudest voice to be deciding, because they may be wrong. The second thing it does is it forces conversations on if something is strategically aligned or not. We all know of times where projects with high expected impact get approved, but they have low demonstrated strategic alignment. They kind of snuck their way into the plan because we're like, whoa, that could really provide a meaningful bump to the P&L. And we have a high confidence that we can do it. But then you look at it and say, yeah, that's true, but it does nothing to create the future that we want. So while we're high confidence of success, do we actually want to be focusing on that to the detriment of where we can be focusing to drive our 5-year vision forward? Again, it's not that this model or process makes the decision, but it brings that kind of tension out into the open. And really, when you have a project with high expected impact but low alignment, it puts it on trial for its life. This is the time to decide, are we going to chase things like that? Or are we going to double down on things that we think truly move us forward to the vision and the future that we want for this organization? This process also forces a discussion on that expected impact, both the size of the impact measured by, say, margin earned, volume won, the tonnage handled, the dollars saved, whatever it is. So what's the actual size of that impact? And then where does the impact land relative to the other outcomes that were laid forth in the plan? Almost think about this as like a portfolio view of your strategic initiatives. If you got 5 main outcomes that you're looking for in your plan, you should be able to quantitatively look at the things you've said we're going to do and see, do those 5 things, are these projects actually going to move forward all 5 of these efforts? This is not a dig at anyone in particular, but one of the things I think is very interesting is oftentimes one of the things that features very prominently on the future that we want to create for client organizations is dramatic improvement in safety or sustained safety leadership. But then you don't see a lot of meaningful, specific initiatives and investments reflected in the plan. That is within the decision rights of leadership to go whichever way they want. But I think it's really important that we say, look, from a portfolio view, we said that this outcome was really important to us, but we don't see anything in the portfolio that's going to generate a meaningful impact against that objective. And this is the time that we want to ask that question. And this process that I've laid forth is a way to highlight that. So this process does all of this, plus we have built a modeling tool that captures all this information. It helps visualize the collective results of all those initiatives. And for us, we find this is very helpful, again, because it puts more data into the decision-making process. And it helps teams look at the initiatives as a portfolio of efforts that drive different parts of that strategy, and they pull on different resources and shared resources in the organization. It's just a really important stress test as that plan at this point starts to firm up and get closer to finalization. There's one other knock-on benefit too that I want to share. When you follow this kind of process and this sort of measuring testing mechanism at the end, it creates more alignment and buy-in among the leadership team on those down-selected strategic initiatives because they can see it better, it's crisper, it's clearer. And this flows through to a better ability among management to communicate the plan throughout that organization. Talking about why some projects were chosen is pretty easy when you come out of a strategic planning workshop, right? When you start to distribute the information throughout the organization. But this helps you also articulate not just why these projects were chosen, but why many other strong project candidates ultimately did not make the cut, right? Not every good idea gets funded. And it gives you the tools to talk about not just the merit, but the relative merit of one initiative compared to another, which is what this is all about. Strategy is about making choices about where to play and how to win. And activation is about making choices about how to execute that strategy. And this helps you bring the rest of that business along with you. So this concludes our little pilot of a multi-part mini-series, this time focused on strategy activation within this pod. I want to say thank you for listening in. I also want to invite you to let me know what you think. This is a little bit of a different medium or different structure that we've taken as a test. So whether it's by leaving a review of the show, dropping me a DM on LinkedIn, or contacting me via our website, if you want more of this, that's great to know. If you want less of it, I also really would like to know that. And if you want to hear something different, I'd love to hear that too. Thank you for listening to today's episode and for listening to the Pacesetter Pod and being part of our community. I never take for granted the fact that you take the time to listen, to consider what we're talking about, and action ways to improve strategy execution in your agribusiness. It means a lot. And I just want to say thank you, as always, for joining us. And I look forward to having you join us again next time right here in the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.